"Get your hands off me," the man screamed, his voice echoing against the high-vaulted ceilings, but the guards didn't listen. They grabbed the man in the simple black suit, twisting his arms behind his back until his knuckles turned white. "I don't care who you think you are," Julian, the Gala coordinator, spat as he stepped closer, his face twisted in a sneer of pure hatred. "This seat is for the elite. It's for people with names that matter. You're just a mistake that slipped through the door. Look at your skin, look at your clothes. You belong in the kitchen with the rest of the help." 500 of the wealthiest people in New York froze, forks halfway to their mouths, as they watched the youngest shipping magnate in the world, Zaid al-Mansur, being treated like a common thief. Zaid didn't fight. He stood there, his eyes like cold embers, watching Julian with a terrifying stillness. "You are making a mistake that will cost you everything you've ever touched," Zaid said, his voice low, steady, and vibrating with an authority that should have made Julian's blood run cold. But Julian just laughed, signaling the guards to pull harder. "The only thing it's costing me is the time I'm wasting talking to you. Throw him out. And take this old woman with him." Julian pointed a finger at Sarah, an elderly black maid who was shaking, her hands clutching a silver tray so hard her veins were popping. "Sir, please." Sarah cried out, her voice breaking the silence of the room. "You don't understand. If you do this, there is no turning back. This man is nothing." Julian roared, reaching out and violently swatting the tray from Sarah's hands. The silver crashed to the floor, the sound ringing out like a funeral bell. "And you're a nobody who's lucky I don't call the police on both of you. Drag him out of my sight." The audience watched in a trance of shock and secret delight as the billionaire was dragged across the marble floor. His shoes screeched against the stone, a sound of pure humiliation. Julian stood in the center of the VIP section, adjusting his cufflinks, looking like he had just won a war. But then, something happened that no one expected. Sarah, the woman who had spent 40 years being invisible, didn't follow them out. She didn't cry. Instead, she walked straight to the main stage, her footsteps heavy and deliberate. She grabbed the microphone, and the feedback hummed through the massive speakers, making everyone wince. "Julian Vane," she said, her voice no longer trembling. It was the voice of a judge. "You just dragged the king of the al-Mansur Empire out of his own ballroom. But that's not your biggest mistake." The guards stopped at the exit. Zaid turned his head, a small, dark smile finally touching his lips. Sarah looked at the crowd of millionaires and then back at the trembling Julian. "You think you know who I am because I clean your toilets and wash your wine stains. But 30 years ago, when Zaid's mother died in the desert, it was my milk that fed him. It was my hands that raised him. To you, he is a CEO. To me, he is my son. And you just laid hands on my family." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a remote device, a master override for the hotel security. With one click, the massive iron doors of the Gala slammed shut and locked. The lights turned a deep, blood red. "Now," Sarah whispered into the embassy, her eyes burning with 60 years of suppressed fire. "Nobody leaves until we decide who truly belongs in the gutter." The sound of the heavy iron doors slamming shut echoed through the ballroom like a thunderclap, vibrating in the chests of every millionaire and socialite present. The blood-red emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows against the gold-leafed walls, turning the room from a palace of luxury into a cage of judgment. The laughter had died. The whispering had stopped. The only sound was the heavy, rhythmic breathing of Julian Vane, who was suddenly realizing that the old maid he had just insulted was standing on the stage like a vengeful queen. Zaid al-Mansur, still held by the two guards near the exit, didn't move. He didn't have to. The guard's grip on his arms began to loosen as they looked at the locked doors and then back at Zaid's face. In the red light, Zaid's eyes looked like polished obsidian. He straightened his tuxedo jacket, adjusted his cuffs, and looked at the guards. "I suggest you let go now," he said, his voice as calm as a graveyard. "Before the legal consequences of kidnapping a foreign diplomat and the CEO of al-Mansur Global become the least of your worries." The guards practically jumped back, their faces turning pale. They looked at Julian, seeking orders, but Julian was paralyzed. He was staring at Sarah, who was still standing at the podium, her hand resting on the microphone as if it were a scepter. "Julian," Sarah's voice boomed through the speakers, filling every corner of the vast hall. "You spent your whole life looking down at people, thinking the height of your heels made you a giant. You looked at me and saw a servant. You looked at Zaid and saw an outsider. You never looked at us and saw human beings. And that, Julian, is why you will never be fit to lead." Zaid began to walk back toward the center of the room. Every step he took on that marble floor sounded like a drumbeat of doom. The guests parted for him like the Red Sea, their heads bowed, terrified that even looking him in the eye would result in their financial ruin. Julian tried to find his voice, his throat dry as bone. This is a misunderstanding. Sarah, you're confused. You're just a maid, you don't have the authority to. I am the woman who owns the land this hotel is built on." Sarah interrupted, her voice cracking with the weight of a secret she had kept for decades. The room gasped. 30 years ago, Zaid's father didn't just give me a job. He gave me a partnership. When the Almansa Empire was just a few ships and a dream, it was my life savings, my hard-earned pennies from cleaning houses, that helped buy the first tanker. I am the silent partner of Almansa Global. I chose to stay in the shadows, I chose to keep cleaning, because I wanted to see the true face of the people my son was doing business with. She looked out at the sea of wealthy faces, many of whom had snapped their fingers at her for more champagne just an hour ago. And tonight, I saw it. I saw how you treat those you think are beneath you. Zaid finally reached the foot of the stage. He looked up at Sarah with a look of pure, unadulterated love, the kind of look a man only gives to the woman who gave him life. He then turned to face Julian. "My mother told me that power is a test," Zaid said, his voice vibrating with a dangerous energy. "If you use it to lift others, it grows. If you use it to crush others, it becomes the weight that buries you. Julian, you didn't just insult a maid tonight. You insulted the foundation of my entire life. You touched the woman who taught me how to walk, how to speak, and how to lead with honor." Zaid reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He pressed a single button. Instantly, every guest's phone in the room began to chime with a notification. It was a news alert, a market flash. Almansa Global pulls all investments from Vane Real Estate. Stock plummeting 40% in after-hours trading. Julian's phone fell from his hand, shattering on the floor. He collapsed to his knees, his expensive suit wrinkling as he clutched at Zaid's trousers. "Please. Zaid. Mr. Almansa. I didn't know. I'll do anything. I'll apologize to her. I'll get on my knees." Zaid looked down at him, not with anger, but with a cold, clinical pity. "It's too late for an apology, Julian. An apology is for an accident. What you did tonight was a reflection of your soul. And I don't do business with rotten souls." Sarah stepped down from the stage, her movements slow and graceful. She walked over to the silver tray Julian had swatted away. She picked it up, wiped a smudge off it with her apron, and handed it to the trembling Julian. "You wanted to see someone served tonight, Julian?" Sarah asked softly, her eyes piercing through him. "The night is still young. And the guests are very thirsty." The silence that followed Zaid's market-crushing announcement was more terrifying than any scream. Julian remained on his knees, his hands trembling as they gripped the edges of the silver tray Sarah had forced upon him. The diamond gala had turned into a funeral for his reputation. But Zaid and Sarah weren't finished. They didn't just want Julian's bank account, they wanted to expose the rot in the entire room. Zaid turned his back on the broken man and walked toward table 2, where the city's mayor and 3 of the most powerful hedge fund managers were sitting. Just 10 minutes ago, they had been laughing at Julian's jokes about Sarah's age. Now, they were trying to hide behind their silk napkins, avoiding Zaid's predatory gaze. "Mayor Higgins," Zaid said, his voice dropping to a whisper that felt like a cold blade against the neck. "I recall you nodding when Julian called Sarah an old crow. You've accepted $3 million in campaign donations from my family's foundation. Tell me, does that money also smell like the loading dock to you?" The mayor's face turned a deep, shameful purple. "Zaid, please, I didn't want to cause a scene." Julian is a big donor to the city. Julian was a donor, Zaid corrected him sharply. Now, he is a lesson. And you, Mayor, are a disappointment. Zaid turned to the room, his voice rising, filling the space with the resonance of a desert storm. Tonight was supposed to be about charity, about giving back to the less fortunate. But I look around this room and I don't see any charity. I see hunters wearing tuxedos. I see people who think their bank balance gives them the right to treat a woman who has worked for 60 years as if she were a piece of gum on their shoe. On the other side of the room, Sarah began to walk between the tables. She didn't look like a maid anymore. The red emergency lights made her silver hair look like a crown of fire. She stopped at table 5, where a young socialite was desperately trying to hide her phone under the table. "Don't put it away, dear," Sarah said softly, her voice carrying a weight that made the young woman freeze. "You were filming it, weren't you? You wanted to show your friends how funny it was to see an old woman get humiliated. You wanted the likes and the views from the pain of a person you thought couldn't fight back." Sarah reached out and gently took the phone from the woman's hand. The woman didn't dare resist. Sarah held the phone up for everyone to see. "This is your world," Sarah said to the crowd. "A world where someone suffering is your entertainment. You all saw Julian drag Zaid. You all saw him swat the tray out of my hands. And not one of you stood up. Not one of you said stop. You were too afraid of losing your seat at the VIP table." Sarah walked back to Julian, who was still paralyzed on the floor. She looked down at him, her expression one of deep, ancient sorrow. "You thought you were dragging a stranger, Julian. But you were dragging your own soul across that floor. You thought you were throwing me out, but you were throwing away your last chance to be a decent man." Zaid stepped up beside her, placing a protective arm around her shoulders. The contrast was striking, the tall, powerful billionaire in his prime, and the small, resilient woman who had raised him. Together, they looked like an unbreakable fortress. "The gala is over," Zaid announced, his voice echoing with finality. "Every investment, every contract, and every partnership Almansa Global has with anyone in this room is now under ethics review. If you stood and watched Julian's cruelty without a word, consider our business finished. We do not build empires with cowards." The guests began to scramble, panic setting in. They realized that their silence had just cost them millions. Julian finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "You can't do this. You'll ruin the city's economy. You're doing this over a maid." Zaid leaned down, his face inches from Julian's. "I'm doing this for my mother. Because in my world, a mother's honor is worth more than all the gold in New York." "Guards." The same 2 guards who had dragged Zaid out now stepped forward, but their heads were bowed in shame. "Mr. Almansa, we are so sorry," one of them stammered. "We were just following orders." "Then follow mine now," Zaid said coldly. "Julian Vane is no longer a guest. He is an intruder. Drag him out of his own gala. And make sure the cameras outside get a very good look at his face when he hits the sidewalk." As the guards grabbed Julian, this time with no gentleness, the room watched in absolute, horrified silence as the hunter became the prey. The screech of Julian's designer shoes against the marble was the only sound left in the room. The heavy iron doors of the hotel didn't just open, they groaned like the gates of a prison being unlocked. The cold, midnight air of Manhattan rushed into the heated ballroom, but it wasn't as cold as the glares Julian Vane received as he was hauled toward the exit. The 2 guards, desperate to redeem themselves in Zaid's eyes, didn't hold Julian by the arms. They dragged him by the collar of his expensive tuxedo, his knees scraping against the pavement of the sidewalk. Outside, the paparazzi, who had been tipped off by a mysterious leak, were waiting. The flashes of 100 cameras exploded like lightning, capturing every second of Julian's fall from grace. The man who was supposed to be the Prince of New York was now a shivering wreck on the wet asphalt, his silver tray clattering beside him in the gutter. Inside the ballroom, the red lights faded, replaced by a soft, warm amber glow, but the atmosphere remained heavy with the scent of judgment. Zaid stood with Sarah, his presence commanding the space. He turned to the remaining guests, his voice now quiet but carrying the weight of a mountain. "The buffet is open," Zaid said with a chilling smile. But since you all enjoy watching people serve, you will find no staff tonight. If you are hungry, you will clear your own plates. If you are thirsty, you will pour your own wine. Tonight, you learn the value of the hands you ignore. Without waiting for a response, Zaid guided Sarah toward the private library at the back of the hotel. He needed to be away from the vultures. Once the heavy oak doors of the library closed, the Billionaire CEO facade cracked. Zaid took Sarah's hands in his, hands that were rough, calloused, and smelled of lemon polish and hard work. "I am so sorry, Sarah," Zaid whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have been here sooner. I should have never let you continue to work as a maid. You have enough wealth to buy 10 of these hotels. Why do you insist on putting yourself in the path of people like Julian?" Sarah sat down in a leather armchair, her breath coming in slow, tired cycles. She looked at the gold signet ring on her finger, the one she had held up like a weapon. "Because, Zaid," she said softly, "if I sit in a penthouse, I only see the clouds. If I scrub the floors, I see the truth. I wanted to know if the man I raised had stayed the same, or if the money had turned his heart to stone like the rest of them." She reached out and touched Zaid's cheek. "You passed the test tonight, my son. You didn't protect me because I'm a secret partner. You protected me when you thought I was just a maid with no power. That is the only wealth that matters." Zaid knelt at her feet, the most powerful man in the room, humbled by a woman who owned nothing but her dignity. "But Julian, he called you an old crow. He touched you. I will make sure he never sees the sun on Wall Street again." Sarah's expression changed. It wasn't anger anymore. It was a deep, haunting shadows. "Julian is a small man, Zaid. He is a symptom of a bigger disease. But there is something you need to know. Something your father made me swear to keep secret until the day you were ready to destroy the Almansa legacy to do what is right." Zaid's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about? My father built everything for us. He trusted you more than anyone." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his. "Your father didn't buy that first shipping tanker with just my savings, Zaid. He bought it with the blood of Julian's grandfather. 30 years ago, there was a betrayal. Julian's family thinks we owe them. That is why Julian felt so entitled to sit at your table. He thinks he owns your seat." Zaid felt a chill go down his spine. The room seemed to grow darker. "You're saying, my family's empire is built on a lie?" "It was built on a debt that was never paid," Sarah whispered. "And Julian's father, the man behind the curtain, is coming for it. Tonight wasn't just about a seat at a gala, Zaid. It was the first shot in a war. Julian was the bait, and you just swallowed it by bankrupting his firm. You've triggered a clause in an old contract that even your lawyers haven't seen." Zaid stood up, his mind racing. He had spent his life protecting his family's name, but now he realized he had been living in a house of cards. He looked at Sarah, the woman who had fed him, protected him, and now was tearing down his world to save his soul. "What do I do, Sarah?" he asked, the weight of the billions of dollars on his shoulders suddenly feeling like lead. Sarah stood up, her small frame radiating a terrifying strength. "You don't fight like a CEO, Zaid. You fight like the man I raised in the desert. You don't protect the money. You protect the truth. Because the truth is the only thing Julian's family can't buy." Just then, Zaid's phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. He opened it, and his face went pale. It was a photo of the hotel's basement. The gas lines had been tampered with. "We have to get everyone out," Zaid gasped. "Julian wasn't just meant to humiliate us. He was meant to keep us in the building." The air in the library suddenly felt thin, as if the oxygen was being sucked out of the room. Zaid looked at the photo on his screen, a grainy image of the hotel's main gas manifold, the safety valves bypassed and a digital timer glowing with a malevolent green light. 4:59. 4 minutes and 59 seconds until the Pierre Hotel became a mountain of rubble. "Julian didn't just want to embarrass us," Zaid whispered, his voice shaking with a realization that cut deeper than any financial loss. "He was the sacrifice. His father sent him here to play the fool so we would stay focused on the insult while they rigged the tomb." Sarah didn't scream. She didn't panic. She stood up, her face a mask of calm determination. Then stop talking, Zaid. A king doesn't mourn his palace while his people are still inside. Move. Zaid burst through the library doors back into the ballroom. The scene was chaotic. The elite were bickering over who would pour the wine, their faces red with petty anger. They had no idea they were sitting on a ticking volcano. Zaid sprinted to the stage, grabbing the microphone. Everyone, listen to me. His voice thundered, vibrating with an urgency that silenced the room instantly. This is not a drill. There is a catastrophic gas leak in the basement. You have exactly 4 minutes to exit the building. Leave your bags, leave your coats. Move toward the service exits, now. The panic was instantaneous. The same people who had been too proud to stand up for Sarah moments ago were now trampling over each other like animals. The mask of high society shattered completely. Men in $1,000 shoes pushed elderly women aside. Socialites dropped their diamond clutches to run for the doors. Zaid didn't join the rush. He stayed on the stage, his eyes scanning the crowd for Sarah. But she wasn't following the crowd. She was heading in the opposite direction, toward the service elevators that led to the basement. Sarah. No. Zaid screamed, jumping off the stage and fighting against the tide of fleeing guests. What are you doing? Get out. He caught her by the arm near the kitchen entrance. Sarah turned, her eyes burning with a light Zaid had never seen before. The manual override for the gas lines is in the sub-basement, Zaid. If those valves aren't turned, the blast won't just take this hotel, it will take the 2 city blocks around it. Thousands of people in the subway, the staff in the laundry, the families in the apartments next door, they'll all die. I'll go. Zaid shouted over the roar of the crowd. Give me the keys, I'll do it. You don't know the layout. Sarah yelled back, her voice firm. I've cleaned those pipes for 20 years. I know every bolt and every turn. You have to stay here and make sure the staff in the back are out. The waiters, the dishwashers, they're still in the kitchen because Julian told them they couldn't leave until the silver was counted. Save them, Zaid. That is your duty as their leader. Zaid felt his heart tearing in two. On one side was the woman who was the only mother he had ever known, walking into a death trap. On the other side were 50 innocent workers, ignored by the fleeing elite, who were about to be buried alive. I won't leave you, Zaid choked out, his eyes stinging. Sarah placed a firm, calloused hand on his chest. You are an Ulmancer. You protect the vulnerable. Now go. If I don't see you on the sidewalk in 3 minutes, you better make sure my name is on the front of every school you build. She pushed him away and vanished into the smoke-filled service corridor. Zaid stood frozen for a split second, then he turned toward the kitchen. He kicked the double doors open. The staff were huddled in the back, terrified, their supervisor holding a clipboard, still shouting about the inventory. Drop the clipboard. Zaid roared at the supervisor, grabbing him by the collar and throwing him toward the exit. Everyone out. Through the delivery ramp. Run. He stayed until the last dishwasher, a young boy no older than 18, was out. He checked the walk-in freezers, the storage rooms, screaming for anyone left behind. The heat was rising through the floorboards. The smell of gas was now overwhelming, sweet and sickly. 1:12. 1 minute and 12 seconds left. Zaid ran toward the main entrance. He burst out onto the sidewalk just as the last of the gala guests were being pushed back by the police line. He looked around wildly. Julian was there, sitting on the curb in handcuffs, his face covered in blood and tears, watching the hotel with a horrific anticipation. Where is she? Zaid screamed, grabbing a police officer by the vest. Where is Sarah? The officer shook his head. Nobody else is coming out, sir. The basement is a furnace. Zaid turned back toward the hotel, ready to sprint back into the maw of the building. But just as he took his first step, a massive, muffled thud shook the ground. The windows of the first 3 floors shattered outward in a rain of glass. A plume of black smoke erupted from the sidewalk grates. Then, silence. The explosion hadn't happened. The big one that would have leveled the block had been suffocated. Zaid fell to his knees, his eyes fixed on the smoke-filled entrance. Sarah. He whispered, the word a prayer. The crowd held its breath. Seconds felt like hours. Then, through the thick, swirling black smoke, a small, dark figure appeared. She was hunched over, coughing, her white maid's apron now black with soot and grease. She was dragging something behind her, a heavy, metal briefcase she had found in the sub-basement. Zaid didn't wait. He sprinted past the police tape, through the falling ash, and scooped her up into his arms. She was hot to the touch, her hair singed, but she was breathing. "I got it," she wheezed, clutching the briefcase to her chest. "The contract. The debt. I got the proof, Zaid." Zaid didn't care about the briefcase. He held her tight, crying openly in front of the cameras, the billionaire and the maid, a son and his mother. But as the paramedics rushed over, Julian's father, Marcus Vane Sr., stepped out of a black limousine across the street. He didn't look at his son in handcuffs. He looked at Zaid and Sarah, his eyes cold and murderous. He held a phone to his ear and spoke 4 words that chilled the air more than the winter wind. Phase 2. Kill them. The atmosphere on the sidewalk was thick with the smell of ozone and burnt silk. As the paramedics swarmed around Sarah, Zaid stood as a human shield, his eyes locked onto the black limousine across the street. He saw Marcus Vane Sr. lower his phone, a cold, predatory smile stretching across his face. The accident had failed, but the execution was just beginning. Suddenly, 2 dark SUVs screeched around the corner, blacking out the light from the street lamps. Men in tactical gear, masks obscuring their faces, began to step out. The police were occupied with the crowd and the fire. These men were moving with a precision that meant only one thing: professional hits. "Sarah, give me the briefcase," Zaid commanded, his voice turning into a weapon. Sarah, despite her charred lungs and trembling limbs, looked up at him. "It's not just paper in here, Zaid. It's the digital key to their offshore accounts. The blood money they used to fund this hit. If you open this, you don't just win, you destroy them for 3 generations." The first gunman raised his weapon. Zaid didn't flinch. He grabbed the briefcase and held it high, right in the line of the cameras that were still broadcasting live to millions across the globe. "Marcus Vane." Zaid roared, his voice echoing through the chaos. "The world is watching. Every move you make is being streamed to the International Court of Justice. You want this briefcase? Come and take it in front of the whole world." The gunman hesitated. They were professionals, and professionals don't like witnesses. Marcus Vane Sr., seeing the red live lights on the news cameras, felt the ground crumble beneath his feet. He had lived his life in the shadows, but Zaid had just dragged him into a sun so bright it was blinding. Zaid flipped the latches on the briefcase. Inside wasn't just a contract, it was a high-frequency transmitter. Sarah hadn't just saved the building. She had retrieved the black box of the Vane family's illegal operations, which they had hidden in the hotel's secure substructure years ago. 30 years ago, Zaid shouted to the reporters, "my family was told we owed a debt to the Vanes. Tonight, we found the truth. The debt was a fraud. The Vanes didn't help us, they robbed us. And tonight, the interest is due." Zaid pressed a button on the transmitter. Instantly, the giant digital billboards in Times Square, just a few blocks away, flickered. The internal ledgers of Vane real estate, the bribery logs, the faked safety reports, the evidence of the gas line tampering, began to scroll across the screens for every New Yorker to see. Julian, still sitting in handcuffs on the curb, watched his family's empire evaporate in a series of white numbers on a black screen. He let out a pathetic, broken wail. His father, Marcus, didn't even wait for the police. He dove back into the limousine and tried to flee, but a phalanx of Ulmansa security vehicles, led by Zaid's private team, boxed him in within seconds. The war was over. The Vane Empire was dead. 3 months later, the Pierre Hotel had been rebuilt, but it was no longer the Pierre. It was now the Sarah Maktoum Center for Dignity. The gold leaf was gone, replaced by warm wood and walls filled with the stories of the city's workers. The grand reopening was not a gala for the elite. The guests were the waiters, the maids, the drivers, and the forgotten. At the center table, the same VIP table where the story began, sat Sarah. She was no longer wearing an apron. She wore a stunning gown of deep emerald silk, a traditional African headwrap, and the Ulfair's royal signet ring on her finger. Zaid stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder. He had liquidated the Vane assets and turned them into a global trust for service workers' rights. He looked down at the woman who had raised him, his eyes filled with a peace he had never known. "You look like a queen, Sarah," Zaid whispered. Sarah smiled, taking a sip of tea, served to her by a man who was being paid a thriving wage. "I always was a queen, Zaid. You just finally got the lighting right." In the halls of power, we often mistake the crown for the person. We look at the hands that clean our tables and see only the work, never the soul. But true power is not found in a bank account or a VIP seat. It is found in the heart that refuses to be quiet in the face of cruelty. Zaid al-Mansur learned that his empire was built on a shadow, but it was saved by a woman who knew that the truth is the only currency that never devalues. Justice is not a gift given by the powerful to the weak, it is a right reclaimed by the brave from the arrogant. As the sun sets on the city, remember this: the person you ignore today might be the only one standing between you and the ruins of your own making. Treat the maid with the same respect you give the king, for in the eyes of the divine, the only title that matters is human.